Hi there. You're here because you're interested in learning more about cybersecurity vulnerability assessments for your organization. So in this video, I'm hoping to cover most of the common questions that we get asked by our customers and prospects about vulnerability assessments, such as how much does it cost? What does it look like? What are the reports? What do you typically find? And any downsides to this exercise. So hopefully by the time you've gone through this video, you've got a pretty good sense of what a vulnerability assessment is and whether or not it makes sense for your organization. My name is Shahzad Mustafa, and I'm the president of Indus Flow Systems. Indus Flow Systems is a Canadian managed IT services company based out of the Toronto region. So let's just dive right into it. The first question that comes up is, what is a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, and how does it differ from the other sets of cybersecurity tools that exist out there? Well, let me tell you a little bit of a story, and hopefully from here you'll appreciate what vulnerability assessments are. If you recall, back in March of 2026, there was a massive cybersecurity breach at a billion-dollar medical devices company called Stryker. And what happened there was completely unbelievable. Basically, the hackers were able to phish the identity of an admin user and then use that admin user to gain access to Stryker's Microsoft 365 environment and essentially use Intune to wipe out all of their devices, their laptops, their mobile devices, and so on. So in the morning, when employees come to work, their computers and their mobile devices don't work. Imagine the disruption that occurred. What's really interesting about Stryker was that they did not actually get breached with a virus or a malware. Typically, that's what we think about when we think about a cybersecurity vulnerability. Rather, it was more of an identity issue. The hackers, once they gained access to the identity of an admin user, were able to simply walk in as if the door was open. No need to infest the organization with a malware or a virus. Once they gained access, they exploited a vulnerability that their cybersecurity team had left open on their Microsoft 365 tenant, which allowed a single admin user to gain that much power to wipe out all their devices. Typically, in a well-managed 365 tenant, you've disabled that ability for a single user to have that much power. So this shows you an example of a vulnerability. This is a billion-dollar company with probably a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity budget. They may have had the latest tools, the latest firewalls, the latest email security tools, the latest endpoint detection software, but they simply did not configure the 365 tenant to prevent this vulnerability, and the hacker was simply able to walk in and disrupt their organization. So what is a vulnerability assessment? Let me break it down for you, right? So there's basically two phases in a vulnerability assessment. There's what we call the scanning phase, and then what we call the reporting phase. In the scanning phase, we use a number of vulnerability assessment tools that are available in the market. These days, we're using ND Pro by Kaseya, and the reason why we're using ND Pro is a very credible tool set, but we get them at a volume discount from Kaseya, and we're able to pass those savings on to our customers. So ND Pro has built into it a number of different scanning technologies to scan your environment for vulnerability. So let me kind of walk through, I guess, the 5 major areas of vulnerability that you might experience. The first one is your network infrastructure. So what our tools do is that they discover what are the assets you actually have on your network, what kind of network topology are you employing, and what are the various ports that are opened up on your network. So a few examples of vulnerabilities that we find typically on networks are OpenRDP ports. These are remote desktop ports, which are very vulnerable for brute force attacks by malicious actors. Once they gain access to your network through RDP, they're able to send a ransomware virus and encrypt your servers. We also see a lot of unused open ports, such as FTP, weak encryption protocols, such as TLS 1.0, and we see some vulnerabilities such as Log4j, which is a very common vulnerability that exists in many software products out there. Other kinds of things that we see are default credentials left unchanged on key devices. And we also sometimes see rogue devices. Sometimes a user might bring in their own device, which is unsecure, and they've plugged that device into your network, and that's a rogue device. It's not secured. We also see a lot of lack of segmentation. We see flat networks, and the problem there is that once you get a malicious actor on one part of your network, there's a lot of lateral movement, and that malicious malware can travel right across your network and wreak havoc. So typically segmentation is where you want to use to prevent that. The second area of vulnerabilities that we scan are your computers and your servers. The things that we look for are things such as unpatched operating systems, out-of-date software such as Adobe and Java. Disabled antivirus software is quite common. We also see a lot of admin sprawl, and that is where you have user accounts with admin privileges being used throughout your network, and that's a big danger. We also see weak password policies, a lack of lockout controls on desktop computers, and these are all things that lend themselves to vulnerabilities on your network. The third area we look at is your Active Directory if you are using Active Directory. So things that we typically find are the overuse of domain admin accounts, orphaned accounts, right? Employees that have left, and those accounts are still running on the network, and they could be a source of a breach. A weak password complexity, excessive file sharing on SharePoint or on networks. Excessive file sharing can introduce data vulnerabilities, right? Data leakage within your organization. We also see situations where there's a lot of service accounts being used, but they have never expiring passwords, and that's also a problem. The fourth area that we look at are your external attack surface. This is your public-facing interface that's available, that's accessible from the internet. So things that we look at is your public IP footprint and other internet-facing devices. Typically, the things that we find are often publicly exposed admin ports, misconfigured VPN, misconfigured certificates, your DNS misconfigurations, and open RDP ports from the internet. Those are the things that we often see, and there could be a lot more things that are exposed through a vulnerability assessment. And finally, the fifth area that I want to focus on are Microsoft 365 and your cloud environment. So things such as your Microsoft 365 configuration. Microsoft 365 has hundreds of settings, and most IT departments are not well trained on what these configurations are and how to use them, right? Their user accounts, how are they set up? MFA, multi-factor authentication, is it set up properly? Conditional access, email security posture, and other cloud workloads such as Azure and AWS. Things that we find often are things such as MFA not configured properly, especially for admin accounts. Many organizations leave a lot of legacy authentication protocols enabled, like MAPI and others, and those create vulnerabilities. Excessive SharePoint sharing, like we explained, and also overuse of the global admin account, right? The global admin is used for everything, and that creates a vulnerability. If somebody gets access to that global admin account, you've got a major breach in your organization. So at the end of the day, our tools will scan for all of these vulnerabilities, and we do this in coordination with your IT department. And then once we're all done, we then do like a walkthrough with your team. So we schedule a detailed walkthrough with your leadership team and your IT team. And what we're interested here is really to give you a cyber attack risk assessment and reporting. So our tools will give us risk scores, executive summaries, and prioritized remediation plans. The executive summaries in particular are useful for non-technical readers, such as your leadership. And what we do is we are essentially converting this raw scan data into actionable prioritized risks for business decisions. Examples that might, at the top of my head, might come up is, for example, a high risk might be, hey, 12 machines on your network are missing critical patches. Another critical risk might be your domain admin account doesn't have MFA. A moderate risk would be, for example, 35% of your endpoints lack disk encryption. So again, all of these risks are explained to you, and we're also giving you a remediation plan. And then based upon your prioritization, you can decide on which risks to mitigate, which ones to maybe schedule for the next quarter, and so on and so forth. Now, the next question that comes up is, does my organization actually need a vulnerability assessment? And the answer is always yes, if you don't already have an existing vulnerability management program within your organization. So many organizations feel, hey, I've got a firewall, I've got antivirus, I've got spam protection, I've got this and that. These are all my tools that I've deployed, and I'm spending good money on it. So why do I need a vulnerability assessment? Well, there's two basic reasons. One reason why organizations do vulnerability assessments is to give reporting to leadership, right? Often leadership they're in a sort of a vacuum of information. They're left in the dark. They don't really know what vulnerabilities actually exist in their organization. Usually that knowledge sits with the IT department, even if they have that knowledge. However, leadership is often responsible for risk, and a cybersecurity breach creates considerable risk for your organization. So if you're a business leader, if you're an executive director, a CEO, or a CFO, and you don't have access to a vulnerability report that's put on your desk every quarter, then you need to insist on one. And using a vulnerability assessment tool set will help you create these reports. The second reason why organizations will ask for this, as an IT manager, you may have invested in a lot of tools and you've worked really hard to implement the right tools for your employer, but you may not know what vulnerabilities still exist in your organization. Your IT environment constantly changes. You're adding new computers, you're adding new employees. Those employees might be downloading stuff that you have no idea about, right? So if you're not running a vulnerability assessment on a regular basis, those risks remain unknown and it puts you in an insecure position. So those are the two sort of main triggers that prompt an organization to ask for a vulnerability assessment. Now, if you already have an existing cybersecurity team that's running regular scans, then you don't obviously need this, right? If you have a vulnerability management program in which these scans are being run every quarter, and then your cybersecurity team is remediating these issues on a quarterly basis, or your managed service provider is doing the same thing, then of course you don't need this kind of vulnerability assessment. Great. So the next question comes up is, can you break down the engagement in more detail? Well, the engagement is roughly 6 steps, and it takes only about 5 to 7 hours. So let's dive into it. The first step is discovery, right? We want to sit with you. We want to sit with your IT department, your IT manager, and understand your environment, right? How many locations do you have? How many endpoints do you have? What are your cloud resources that you have? What is your network topology? We'll ask you a number of questions. And then we'll decide on how to access your network, right? A vulnerability assessment is a little bit invasive, not too invasive. It's a little bit invasive. It does require certain tools to be deployed in your environment with certain level of access. So we need to work with your IT department to figure out how best to deploy those tools. The second step is preparation. One thing that we want to do is we want to whitelist our scanning tools. Often these scanning tools might trigger your own cybersecurity tools like EDR. And so we want to whitelist those tools. And then we also want to give these tools a temporary admin access. So these tools have enough privileges to go in and read details about your environment. Keep in mind that these tools are not making any modifications. They're only reading what's already in your environment. The third step is to deploy agents, right? So we typically deploy a software tool into your network. It's usually done through a remote push, or your internal IT can deploy it themselves using their own credentials. In order to properly assess like laptop computers, then there's a one-click install. So we send the user a package. The user will click it and install the package. The agent will analyze the laptop and report it back and then uninstall itself, right? It does require some interaction by your end users. Step 4 is a scan itself. So like I've described in the previous slide, there are a number of scans that we do: your internal network, individual computers, Active Directory, your Microsoft 365 tenant, and your external attack surface. These are all scanned. These scans run in the background. They typically take about 3 to 4 hours to conduct all the scans. The only exception are laptops that may be offline, right? So if you have a user that has turned off the laptop, then that scan on that laptop won't happen until the laptop is turned back on. So that sometimes might delay the full scan project. Now, step 5 is an internal review, right? So we get all the data, we get some reports, and we review that with our own team, right? We review it, understand what are the vulnerabilities that are being exposed. And if there are any critical issues, we immediately notify your team. Otherwise, we'll compile those reports and schedule a walkthrough with your team. Step 6, of course, is a debrief. And this is typically a 2-hour meeting where we walk you through all the findings. All the reports are issued to you in PDF format, including all the remediation as well. So the question is, what does a report actually contain? The report contains 2 types of reports. You could say is the overall executive summary, which is maybe appropriate for executive level readers that may not necessarily be interested in the technical jargon, but they just want an overall view of their security posture and what are the overall recommendations. And then there is a detailed technical review, which contains all of the technical details of the vulnerabilities and the remediation recommendations. The executive summary is plain language. There's a scorecard approach to presenting the summary, very easy to read. And the technical findings will categorize every single issue and clear remediation steps. So for example, one client comes to mind, a long-term care home. They have over 250 computers. When we ran through the scanning, we detected a number of vulnerabilities. One of the major ones was there was no account lockout on over 200 computers. That means that when users have logged in, they can walk away and the computer stays logged in. Anybody else can come up and interact with that computer, right? We also found with the same client over 5 compromised staff credentials on the dark web, and that breach had happened just a few weeks before, and the organization had no idea. So these are the kinds of findings that we were able to come across. Now, the next question that is natural is, what is the cost of a vulnerability assessment engagement? And you'd be surprised it's not very expensive. If you have a network of roughly 250 computers or 250 endpoints, then the cost is $2,000. And it slightly increases for organizations that are larger than that. Now, the question that comes up also is, does this include fixing problems, what we refer to as remediation? And the answer is no. Remediation is not included, but we will explain all the remediation steps to your IT team or your MSP to act on them. Of course, if you need our help to remediate some of these issues, then we're more than happy to help, but the remediation itself is not included in that price. The next question that comes up is there any disruption that I might experience during this vulnerability assessment engagement? And it's understandable, right? Because you don't want, while these scans are running, you don't want users to not be able to access their equipment, right? So a few things here. Number one is that the scans themselves run quietly in the background, right? So they're agent-based. The user doesn't even know what's going on. It just sits in the background and gathers information and sends it back to the reporting tool, right? There might be some minimal performance impact on, let's say, laptops that are maybe not the latest in terms of their hardware specification. So while that agent is running, that user might experience some slight performance impact, but it won't last for very long. In some cases, the tools that we're using may trip your security tools. So we may need to whitelist them with your security tools. Now, there are some risks and downsides, and I want to be completely open about this, right? Number one is admin access is required. And this is sometimes very difficult for organizations to share, right? Obviously, with an external provider like us, giving out admin access is very, it's a very uncomfortable doing that, right? The other issue is, of course, is a time commitment for your IT department to be involved in working with us during this engagement, right? And these issues, of course, must be addressed. And what we say is that when we work with clients, we often let them drive the process, right? So we don't actually even need your admin access ourselves. We can simply walk you through the deployment of our tools, and then your IT department can run those tools, deploy it, and all that data comes into the reporting tool, and we don't even need to know that level of access. Of course, for our existing customers for whom we're already providing managed services, we do have access to those admin accounts, and we're able to run those tools ourselves. But if you are a new customer and you're uncomfortable with sharing your admin access, no problem. You can either create a temporary admin account for us to use, or we can walk your team through installing those tools. The time commitment, obviously, that's a given, right? You either spend a little bit of time now resolving these issues, as opposed to spending a lot of time later on when you actually get one of these vulnerabilities gets exploited and you do encounter a breach. The time and money and reputational risk that comes with that is nothing compared to the time that you may want to put in at the beginning to expose these vulnerabilities. A question that comes up is, why do I need a vulnerability assessment? Isn't like firewall enough? I have antivirus, I have firewall. Isn't that enough to secure my organization? And many smaller organizations kind of have this mindset, right? I've got my antivirus, I've got my firewall, that should be more than enough, right? So the answer to that is obviously no, it's not enough. Number one is antivirus and firewall are essentially there to prevent access to your network. Antivirus detects things once they've already entered your network, and it only detects infiltrations of malware and viruses and so on. What it doesn't fix are the misconfigurations in your network that can be exploited by bad actors that can even bypass your firewall and your antivirus, right? There are so many organizations that have the latest antivirus and firewall technology, yet experience massive breaches and ransomware attacks. So just remember, antivirus and firewall is simply one layer of security. An effective security program for your organization involves multiple layers of security, and vulnerability assessments is one of those layers. So for example, let's go back to the long-term care example I gave just a few moments ago. One thing that we discovered there was over 30 computers still running Windows 10. Right, Windows 10 is no longer supported by Microsoft. Microsoft is no longer giving security updates for Windows 10. So antivirus won't detect that. Antivirus doesn't care what operating system you're running. It's simply looking for viruses. So the operating system itself is vulnerable. And that's why antivirus in this case would not have been enough to actually prevent a bad actor from exploiting a security vulnerability in Windows 10. Another example of in that same engagement, we also discovered certain legacy protocols still enabled in Microsoft 365, such as IMAP or POP3. These are old protocols used to access your email. And unfortunately, they bypass MFA. MFA is not able to secure these legacy protocols. So typically in a modern network, we disable IMAP, we disable POP3. But if they're still enabled for whatever reason, you've got a vulnerability. So another question that comes up is often from your IT department, and they have concerns. They may resist third-party scans, right? They're not trusting of an outside vendor running tools on their network, and that tension is very, very real. And that's why we want to be open in terms of what we're actually doing. We will partner with your IT department. We will let your IT department run the tools themselves. And of course, your IT department should be familiar with those tools by going to ND Pro and learning about those tool sets, right? And that way you're, by building up a trusting relationship with your IT manager, we may be able to run some of these tools on your IT manager's behalf. So at the end of the day, keep in mind that accountability for risk sits with your executive team, right? Your executive team ultimately owns risk, not your IT department, not your IT team. Your IT team is an important department within your organization, but at the end of the day, when your organization encounters a significant breach, it's the leadership that gets asked, well, what happened? Did you not realize that we had these vulnerabilities? So visibility matters and accountability matters. And we feel that vulnerability management, vulnerability assessments puts a little bit of power back into the hands of leadership so they gain visibility on risk, and then they work with your existing IT group to manage that risk. So in closing, I've tried to explain everything about our engagement. And you can see from that long-term occur example that a number of vulnerabilities were exposed in different aspects of the network. Every computer environment differs, but the patterns tend to repeat. Our call to action is number one, review the frequently asked questions that we have on this webpage and visit IndusFlow Systems and visit the vulnerability assessment webpage. And there's more questions that you can that are answered for you that are not in this video. And finally, reach out to us, have a conversation to see if vulnerability assessments make sense for your organization. Thank you very much. Goodbye.